I've been in the business for 44 of those 80 years. It's a long time. And it's a second career for me because I was in the corporate world in Cincinnati after college. So, I came back and 44 years later, here we are. Still having fun.
And to boot, in his spare time, he's president of the Delaware County Historical Society. So maybe you can share a little bit
Well, I
about
can do that. Well, thank you very much, Linda.
But tonight is
Well, it's a
railroads.
real pleasure to come down, and I appreciate Linda asking me to talk about a real love of mine, which is traction in Delaware County, namely known as the CDM, Columbus, Delaware, Marion Interurban, and also the Delaware Electric Street Railway. Did any of you know that Delaware had streetcars? We did. We had Delaware, the city of Delaware had quite an elaborate, here comes somebody, quite an elaborate streetcar system in the late 1890s and into the early years of the 20th century. And just getting started. And so the CDM ran obviously from Columbus through Delaware to Marion and back. And what I'd like to do is I have some nice photos and slides, and we'll get to those, but I'd like to tell you a little bit before I get into the slides, a little bit about the CDM and the Delaware Electric Street Railway. First of all, let me back up and tell you a little bit about my love of trains and railroad history. Gosh, I've been an avid model railroader, still am from day one with our. A lot of us will remember those Lionel sets, and I kept my Lionel set. And then when my son, who's now 40, but when he was a little guy, then we would set up the trains around the Christmas tree, and then they'd evolve and this sort of thing. So trains have been, and I can remember many of you rode trains. I rode trains. Rode the old Pennsylvania Railroad. I had grandparents that lived over in Pittsburgh. And we used to catch the old Pennsylvania Railroad at Crestline and ride east to Pittsburgh. I can still remember that as a young boy. And I was so thrilled with standing at the station, looking way down the track and seeing that headline coming in. And the anticipation for a young guy was just almost too good to be true. And I can remember my late dad taking me out to the C&O, which was formerly the Hocking Valley, which runs right through here, just west of us, through Powell, now CSX, but it was the C&O and their crack passenger train, the Sportsman. It used to run from Washington, D.C. to Detroit, and made stops. I don't know if the Sportsman ever stopped in Powell, but I know it stopped in Delaware. And it would stop in Delaware like 11 o'clock at night. So for a young guy who was maybe 7, 8 years old, that was a real treat to be able to stay up that late and see that headlight way down the track coming up and watching that train stop and so forth. But some great, great memories. Now, the CDM line started in 1902 and lasted until 1933. So it really didn't have that long of a lifespan. And why did the CDM meet its demise? There's a couple of reasons. It was the 1930s. It was the depths of the Depression. Times were tough, real tough. And we had the advent of the internal combustion engine, the automobile, and roadways. And so those two factors, I think, at least from my studies and so forth, have led to the demise of the CDM and the demise of interurbans all over Midwest United States. Now, I was talking to Linda, I believe, earlier, and you could at one time, it would take you a while, but you could literally catch an interurban in Cincinnati and make connections clear to Cleveland. You'd maybe go from Cincinnati north to Dayton, Dayton east to Springfield, Springfield east to Columbus, Columbus doing the CDM through Delaware and Marion, Marion to Bucyrus, Bucyrus to Sandusky, Sandusky east to Cleveland. You could do it. It might take you a while, but we have that infrastructure and now it's all gone. So anyway, we remember. And The logo for the CDM, it was called Through the Heart of Ohio. And how appropriate would that be? Through the Heart of Ohio, that's what they call it. Interurban travel, and I'm going to refer to notes, but I'm reminded of some of you might recall Senator Alvin Barkley from Kentucky, and a true story that Senator Barkley told about public speaking. He was giving a speech one time, and the senator finished, and he took a seat on the dais, and there was a young man sitting next to him, and the senator leaned over, he says, "Young man, how'd I do?" And the young man, he said, "Well, Senator, do you really want to know?" And the senator said, "Well, yeah, I want to know." He says, "First, you read your speech. Second, you read it poorly. And third, it wasn't worth reading." So I'm going to refrain from reading too much of my notes, but I will refer to my notes. So I've always used that as a guide. But interurbans were all over the state of Ohio and all over the Midwest. And you could ride all over the place back in the early part of the 20th century. Interurban lines had their start with the small electric street railways, such as in Delaware, and Delaware was no exception. The Delaware Electric Street Railway was incorporated in 1892 and completed in 1894 and met its demise. The CDM eventually bought the Delaware Electric Street Railway. They shared rails and so forth through downtown Delaware and Sandusky Street. And met its demise in 1926. 1926. So it literally had a very short life, just a couple decades there. And but the Delaware, for a town the size of Delaware back in the turn of the century, maybe, I don't know, I'm just guessing 7,000 to 8,000 people maybe, had 7 miles of track. And let me just think about it. If you know Delaware, let me sketch out where the electric street railway ran. It ran on Sandusky Street from Bell Avenue on the south side to Pennsylvania on the north side. It ran out William Street to the Hocking Valley Depot, which then became C&O and now is CSX, the same line that goes to Nixo. Now there was a park at Stratford, and where exactly the park at Stratford was, I don't know. There was a park out by north of Prospect on your way to Marion, and I'm not sure exactly where that, but they had several different parks. But back to the Delaware Street Railway, they had 7 miles of track, and I took you west off out William Street to the Hocking Valley Depot. I took you east to Greenwood Lake. I took you north and south on Sandusky Street. It branched off on Lincoln Avenue in the north side of Delaware and went west, and there was a tunnel that went under the C&O, the Hocking Valley line, and there was a line, a branch line of the CDM called the Punkin Line, Punkin. Anybody know how that got its name? Somebody told me years ago, and I got to write that down. I've got to do a little more research, but it was known as the Punkin Line. But anyway, that line went west out through Magnetic Springs to Richwood. And the line essentially was going to go from Richwood up to Kenton and over to Lima, but I don't believe it was ever finished beyond Richwood. I have a photograph of building the line on Franklin Street, which is the main street in Richwood, back in the day, but somebody told me, or a couple of sources told me, that they didn't think that the line was ever completed through Kenton to Lima, but it was supposed to have been there. Okay. Now, again, the route of the Delaware City Street Railway, we have north, south, east, and west. We went on Lincoln Street. There was a part of the line went south on Campbell Street and tied into West Central Avenue right by Austin Hall, and then went down Elizabeth Street right next to the Arts Castle and tied back into William Street there. And then there was also another branch of this Delaware Street Railway that served Ohio Wesleyan. It went up University Avenue, which part of that is abandoned now because Wesleyan has taken that street over for the library area. It's around where the fire department is in downtown Delaware, just on the east side of that. And then the line went south on Liberty Street to London Road and back into Sandusky Street, made a loop around it. And so that was the route, 7 miles of track in Little Delaware, Ohio. And the CDM bought that railway in the early 1900s, 1902. The CDM got its birth at the turn of the century, arising from two competing organizations, the CDM and the CD, Columbus, Delaware, and Northern, for the lucrative line, what they thought it was going to be lucrative, and it was, between Columbus and Marion. The two companies joined forces in 1902 to form the CDM, the Columbus, Delaware, and Marion. The first trip on the CDM occurred October 3rd, 1902. A January 1903 timetable, and this was, I got a kick out of this, showed 7 arrivals and departures each day from Columbus to Delaware. And the fare, get this, the fare, one-way fare was 40 cents and the round trip was 75 cents. The record run in 1903 from Columbus to Delaware was 1 hour and 11 minutes. Now you think that is a long time, but they made a lot of stops. And it wasn't until the later years of the CDM that they had express cars where they wouldn't stop. And it was much faster then. But in those cars, the express cars that the CDM bought in 1926, they bought 2 all-steel parlor cars. This is not one of them. This is one of the original CDM cars, car number 40. It was all wooden. I was telling Linda when I came in, I don't know where this photo was taken. It was obviously taken out on the line someplace, and everybody got out of the car for the photographer. And so the line was to Marion was completed in 1903. The CDM purchased the Marion downtown streetcar system, so they owned 2 city streetcar systems. They owned the Delaware streetcar system and the Marion streetcar system. And freight service, believe it or not, freight service was a major revenue enhancer for the CDM. They hauled a lot of freight, and they were in competition with the railroads. Well, the railroads, a story goes, it's kind of a funny story, railroads didn't like the interurbans, and the interurban guys didn't like the railroads. Well, in Delaware, there used to be a branch of the old CC&C Railroad, Columbus, Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati Railroad, that then became the Big Four, that then became Conrail, then became, now it's CSX, and it was Penn Central before Conrail and so forth. But anyway, that line used to have a branch to the Delaware Industrial Park. It used to run across South Sandusky Street right by the Farmers Exchange, if you know where that might be. And so the CDM, of course, had tracks that ran right down the center of Sandusky Street. Well, one day, the story goes that some workers for the CDM were putting in what they called a frog. A frog was where one railroad line would cross another railroad line. And it would allow cars to one set of cars to go this way, the other cars to go this way, a frog. Well, they were establishing a frog. Well, the railroaders didn't like it. And they showed up, a gang of the railroaders showed up, and fisticuffs broke out. They had a big street fight. The police had to come, and they arrested 5 or 6 of them and threw them in jail for a day or 2 and let them sober up and that sort of thing. But that was a real story that happened because the railroaders and the interurban people didn't like each other. Now, the CDM also bought the power, and the old CDM car barns used to sit where Performance Jeep Chrysler sits today. Those were the Delaware car barns. And the Stratford car barns. The Delaware car barns, that building still exists. It's the old it's the Worley Steel building on East Harrison Avenue. And if you look on the west side of that building, you'll see a bunch of big doors that are real narrow. Each of those doors at one time had a track that ran in it. And those doors would open up and the interurban cars would go in and out, and that's where they would service and store the cars at night. Right by where, I remember as an old Friendly's, I think now it's a Marco's Pizza on the corner, but right there at East Harrison Street in downtown Delaware. And if you go and look at that Worley Steel building, it's a big green building, but you'll see those big doors on the west side. And just know that interurban cars 100-some years ago used to go in and out of it all the time, okay? Major stations on the CDM were in downtown Columbus. It was at 3rd and Gay Street. In downtown Delaware, the major station was at the northeast corner of William and Sandusky Street, where the old L&K used to sit, and now it's a coffee shop or Mean and Bean or something, I forget what it is. But that's where the interurban station was. And then in Marion, their station was on East Center Street. Center Street is State Route 309, which runs east and west. And it's Center Street in Marion, Ohio. And the station was in fact, there's a, in Marion, there's a restaurant, an Italian restaurant. They have a branch of the restaurant that took over the old L&K just north of Delaware. The warehouse restaurant, that's what it is. The warehouse restaurant, the original warehouse restaurant sits in the old freight depot of the CDM. You walk in there and they've got a big picture of those number 501 parlor car. It's really cool. It's just like they do at the restaurant just north of Delaware. They've got a big picture of the CDM 501 parlor car. I mentioned the parks. Glenmurray Park was pretty big. It was 54 acres, so it was pretty good size. And in late 1903, cars would leave from Columbus to Marion. Would run from Columbus to Marion in about 2 hours, leaving Columbus every hour. So that was pretty good service. Pretty good service. Here comes somebody else. And now in 1923, the CDM relocated its entrance to Columbus with what was called the Worthington Cutoff. And I think we had talked a little, some of us had talked about that. Swinging the line east from High Street in Worthington to run parallel to the Pennsylvania Railroad downtown, about where the Ohio Railway Museum sits today. And that trackage that the Ohio Railway Museum uses, it's a mile and a half, 2 miles, is the only original trackage left of the CDM. And then it ran down into downtown Columbus. In a last-ditch effort, a couple of events occurred in a last-ditch effort to get ridership on the CDM. In 1926, the CDM purchased 2 all-steel parlor cars, the number 500 and the 501. The 501 still exists today under TARP, and I was talking with this gentleman. That's a dream of mine, if ever I get a chance to do that, is to bring that car, get a committee together, raise money for its refurbishing, rehabilitation. It'll never run again, but to at least build a building, maybe a pole building at Stratford, which was right on the CDM line, right there on the grounds of the Delaware County Historical Society. And in fact, I've gotten the approval of the board for that. If I ever retire and get a chance to do some of this, some of the things I really love to do, if I ever get the time to do it. But then we can have that car for future generations. for young people to sit in the car, to experience sitting and, never ride it, but at least to have that and it'll be undercover and protected because it's under a tarp, languishing outside under a tarp at the Ohio Railway Museum in Worthington, which by and large is a bucket of bolts. But that's just my take because I had left their board. Some of us wanted to really make that into a real railway museum. Others just wanted to play with their real trains. The players won. Those of us who wanted a real museum left. And I've been off the board now for over 10 years. But it's still a wonderful play. They have a wonderful collection. They have Columbus's oldest streetcar, 1921. In fact, I think they have just started on I read something, they have just started on an effort to raise money to rehabilitate that car. But they have the CDM car, the 501. And they have the 578, which is a steam locomotive, Norfolk and Western steam locomotive and so forth. Well, let me share, it's getting warm, and let me go through some of these photos, and I think you'll really enjoy some of these photos that I put together. Let's see here. Yeah, this is really not an interurban station. This is a railroad station. Did anybody know where Meredith was? Yep, okay.
A mile from where I grew up.
Okay, well then you know very well where it is.
Sure.
Meredith Radnor, up in Radnor, is on the old Hocking Valley C&O line. That's the Meredith station. There's the old line. Let's see if this will. No, it's not advancing. Uh-oh. Where's my troubleshooter?
Let's see what we can do.
Oh, there we go. There we go.
Oh, my God.
It's just too warm.
This is a scene from the Delaware Street Railway. This was one of the small cars that they had called dinkies. And they called them dinkies, and they were just what they called two-wheel trucks. A truck here and a truck there on two wheels. Some of your bigger cars from here on down. They still exist.
And what year would that be?
I would say, well, with the carriage and so forth, I would say probably that was right around the turn of the century, would be my guess. Late 1890s, something like that. Now, let's see. There we go. Here's another view of the Delaware Electric Street Railway with two of the dinkies. Again, this is on Sandusky Street, just north of William Street. And this is looking from west to east. This building still exists today. Now, what do you think that is there? That was a cigar shop that was up on the third floor, and we've been trying to figure that out. And if anybody has an answer, I'd love to hear it. But we think that that's how they supplied. Maybe they supplied the cigar store. They made cigars and so forth. Well, again, Mr. Frank had his advertising all over the place, Clothier, and I can't tell. I bet you this is another sign for Mr. Frank. You can't really read that, but you can really see the two-wheel trucks here and there. The two-wheel trucks there. Those dinky cars. Okay.
Is that name Frank still around? Is it?
The grandson, Harry Frank, I knew Harry very well, and Harry died about 6-8 years ago. Harry owned several downtown Delaware buildings, and Harry, I don't believe, was ever in the clothing store, but the Frank family started in the 1800s and so forth. So let's move on here. Let's see if we can. There we go. This is a scene of this is an interesting scene here, if we can. Excuse me for pointing here, but you can see a Delaware dinky car. There's a much bigger CDM car behind it. You can barely see the front of a car. That's a Richwood car on the Punkin line. Because they shared the station. This was the old station, the old interurban station there at the northeast corner of William and Sandusky. City Hall would be right over here, you can see they had electric, obviously they had electric traction, but the streets were still mud. So my guess is that was early 1890s, or just after the street railway was begun.
Isn't that Warren's still up on the wall?
It is, yeah, very good. You can still see remnants of that sign. Very good, very good. And, yep. Okay, let's see. Oh, I love this scene. This is the old Pennsylvania Railroad that I said went down the west side of Olentangy River and about where the Route 23 bypass goes through town. This was all taken up, but this is Winter Street Bridge. There's a Delaware dinky either entering the bridge or coming off the bridge. You can barely see two horses, somebody walking on the bridge. There's two horses coming across. But the Delaware Street Railway went across the river and out to Lake Street and then took a left out to Greenwood Lake. And that's a great, great picture. This picture is of a parade. Now you can see the Bourne sign is now Chew Honest for chewing tobacco, because there was a tobacco place up here on the 3rd floor. But you can also tell that the streets are paved with brick. So my guess is this was a parade probably around around the First World War maybe. Vintage, but there is a car, interurban car on the Pumpkin line. You can see how the line tied into the South Sandusky line there. And then it went out. Actually, the Pumpkin line is interesting because it went out Lincoln Avenue, went up north on Sandusky Street to Lincoln, went west on Lincoln, went under the Hocking Valley Railroad, and then continued on west across country, David Road and so forth. I've got a picture of a bridge over the side of the river coming up, but it eventually made its way to Magnetic Springs. And that was the Pumpkin line. Okay. Here is a Ridgewood car. This is on the bridge, the then bridge. The abutment still exists up around Fulton Creek Road. But this is a Ridgewood car stopped on the bridge. Everybody was looking out the window with photographer, including the motorman, but that says Ridgewood car. That's on the old Pumpkin line. Either going or coming, you can't tell which one it is. This is a CDM car south of Delaware. Route 23 existed, ran on this side. This is on the east side, so this would be old car 52. And they used to have these little shanties at various places, and that's where people could wait under cover. It'd still be very cold, but at least you may not get wet. They would wait for the interurban car to come, and they would make it stop. There's a car that stopped, and that would be probably south of Orange Route. Okay, this is one of my favorite photos because this is where my business is located in downtown Delaware. This is the northeast corner of Winter and Sandusky Streets. Back in the day, here is an old Delaware dinky on the old streetcar line in downtown Delaware. This was a men's clothing store back in the day. The Smith Brothers Clothing Store, where my office exists now. We moved there in 1996. This building was built in 1855, so it goes back a long way. Now, this building back here on East Winter Street still exists. It's now offices on the first floor, but the 1 Hour Martinizing shop used to be there, if some of you may remember that. But this has essentially been torn off. That was a big opera house on the second floor. And they would have dances, they would have programs and everything, a big opera house up there on the second floor. That's essentially been torn off. But J.L. Smith, what was it, W.A. or something at J.L. Smith Clothiers. And there's a Delaware dinky streetcar. Okay. Here's another view of a Ridgewood car. You can't tell it, but if you see it, you can tell Ridgewood. But there is the motorman and the conductor outside their car. And not sure where that picture was taken, but it is what it is. This is an interesting picture. This is pretty close to where we are now. This was the old Flint trestle. Josephinian College would be back up here on the hill. Camp Mary Orton would be down around Route 23. I was talking with somebody before. Route 23 was a two-lane road. It came along the west side of this bridge. It sort of curved around and came up. And but my dad remembers, he told me before he passed away, he remembered riding one of the big old all-steel cars, the 500 or 501, and he'd get out there on that bridge, and that would be a big, heavy car and go pretty fast, and that would go back, and he'd be a little guy looking over the window. He thought he would go over the side. But when that was built, it was 990 feet long, about 90 feet high. It was one of the largest trestles ever built for a railway or interurban in the United States. One of the largest trestles. Really interesting. Here is a view, and I mentioned this before. This is on the Pumpkin Line looking west. I believe somebody told me this house still exists today. 257 would be over here. Fulton Creek Road runs off here someplace. The bridge abutments you can still see over the Sauter River. But that is a view of the old Pumpkin Line going west. Here is a view of, I believe this was Stratford, I believe. This was the pavilion. As I mentioned, they had several parks. And they would use this pavilion for programs, for dances and so forth. And obviously the river is out here, so it was sat along the river. Exactly where this sat, I've got to do some more research. I don't know exactly where that sat, but that is the old Stratford.
Is that different from Eccles Lake then?
Yes, it is. Eccles Lake is different, because I remember going to Eccles Lake when I was a kid. And Eccles Lake essentially took over, it's up off Pollock Road, which is north of what we're looking at here. And it was a couple of old quarries. And that's what Eccles Lake was.
So this is actually down, I mean, basically down where the Jeep dealership is now, was that?
That's my understanding. That's my understanding. We're in that vicinity. Now, the old car barns were in that same vicinity, and this may be the car barn here, I'm not sure. But it's in that vicinity.
So
And
that's
this
the
is
old
river.
Tangy.
This is the old Tangy River, right, exactly. Okay. Now, this is an interesting scene. This is an interesting scene of downtown Delaware. And you've got two CDM cars there in the middle of Sandusky Street. And you can see where they had two sets of tracks, one going this way, one coming north. And this is the old City Hall building that burned in 1934, one of downtown Delaware's most spectacular fires. And the current City Hall sits at that site. So this would be looking probably mid-block between Winter and William, looking south would be my guess. Mid-block. And a lot of these buildings still exist.
Jack,
Yeah.
when you move that, you've got the interurban, you've got a car, an early car to the right,
You
and
do.
you've got the horse-drawn carriage on the left.
Yeah,
Talk about
exactly. You got them all.
transportation.
You got them all, Sherry. Very good. Very good. And so my guess would be probably this would be around 1910, something like that. Very earliest part of the 20th century would be my guess.
Coca-Cola was in Vogue.
There you go. Yep. Sure was. Here is a shot of a CDM car either going north or south on North Sandusky Street. This is, my building is right over here. This is the old Fort Delaware Hotel, known as the American House. It was known as the Donovan House in its day, went way back into the 1800s. It was torn down in 1976, and PNC Bank building occupies that. Here's the old Delaware City Hall, building to your right with the tall steeple. And there's an interurban car coming up Sandusky Street.
Jack, when did that stop operating as a hotel? You got a decade on that?
Well, I remember when I was a boy, that was still operating barely as a hotel, but it stopped. There were offices, I remember in its last years, the United Way office was on the second floor up here, because I used to go up and call on Nancy Frankenberg in that, up in here. My guess would be the 1960s sometime.
I remember going in that.
Yeah, they had a big restaurant around here on East Winter Street, and I can remember eating there as a small boy, and, yep.
What is this shoe man? And then it was like a statue or light pole?
Well, yeah, now, one of the mysteries was whatever happened to that statue. Marilyn Kreider, who used to be with, a long time with our Historical Society, she did some research, and she said that was hit and wiped out by a car in the 1930s, and they never replaced it, because that's right out in front of my office. That's right on the corner in front of my office. My office is right here. So that is a statue, and, yep, but it was wiped out by a car in the 1930s.
Look at the tops of those light, or those electric poles.
Oh, yeah.
All
yeah.
the insulators,
Oh,
how many
yeah.
different lines must
Unbelievable.
run.
Unbelievable. You're right, you're right. Great photos. I think, yeah, we've got two more photos. This is the Worley Plumbing Supply building on East Harrison Street. And you can see these big doors, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 on the west side of that building. And they had a track going into each one of those. And that's where they kept the cars. And that was taken probably about 10 years ago by me. This is an interesting photograph. This is a Delaware dinky car coming up South Sandusky Street on the hill right in front of Ohio Wesleyan. Now, my thinking is that this was probably in the early 1890s, just after the start of the Delaware Electric Street Railway, because, number one, the street is not paved, it's dirt. Number two, there's Gray Chapel, Thompson Chapel, which was torn down by Slocum, it was replaced by the Slocum Library in 1898. And of course, that's been further changed because the library has moved across, Bagley Library in early 1968 or something. And then Sturgis Hall, which was built in 1855. And so, just by these buildings, you have to guess that this was prior to 1898. Interesting photograph. This is a shot of, this building is now torn down and the smokestack is torn down, but that was the old power plant for the CDM that sat north of Prospect. And that supplied a lot of the power to the CDM.
How was it run? Was it coal power?
It was coal powered, and they would run trains in there with coal and so forth. This is a scene of the CDM with Route 23. This would probably be way south, south of the county, maybe just east over here. I can't really see, I don't think those houses exist anymore, but this fella is walking in the middle of the rails, which he shouldn't be walking. And, but for the photographer, hey, you know, there you go. But that's Route 23, and that's out along
What,
the...
just east of Route 23 or west of?
This line was east, this is looking north.
Okay.
Now, at some point, north of Orange Road, the line crossed over to the west side and went down Kingman Hill, and you can see the bridge abutments on the west side of the Route 23 bridge. If you look to the right, and you're going across that bridge, you can still see those bridge abutments. And that was where the CDM, and then it took a right and went into Stratford, and went up Stratford Road, which in those days, before they built 23, that was Route 23, was Old Stratford Road into Delaware. And so it ran right in front of the Garth's section where our Delaware County Historical Society has its headquarters, the Meeker House Museum and the barn in Stratford. Ran right in front. So I think we have one more slide to show. Yeah. This is a last-ditch effort, really a last-ditch effort by the CDM. After the trolleys quit running in the early 30s, the CDM bought 12 small General Motors transit buses, and this is one of them, in an effort to haul people around and continue to try to make money. It didn't last long, maybe 2-3 years at the most, from my experience. But you can see Columbus and Delaware, Marion, electric railway, and that's one of the old buses there. So, anyway, it's warm, it's 7:45. I've been at it for 45 minutes. Questions? Yeah?
Okay, did Delaware ever have double-decker trolleys?
No, they didn't. Good question, but no, they didn't. They had just the dinky cars, and they had some full-size cars, but they mostly used the dinky cars, and they were just one story. Yeah.
I showed pictures, I'm from Northwest Ohio, and Toledo had double-deckers for
Did they?
a short
Okay.
time.
Ah,
I asked
okay.
the gentleman that was the expert on the thing, why didn't they last? He said when they took a corner, they fell over.
No? They were took over,
Top
okay.
heavy.
Sherry, a question, yeah.
Yeah, I got a question, I got a couple comments. The question is, we have Bunty Station Road
Yes.
that, into 315, right at that Stratford area. And I can't remember what I was told about that. Did that have to do with the small dinkies? Or with
Dinkies
the,
never made their way that far south, because
Okay.
that was CB&M territory
Okay.
down in Stratford.
okay,
And
So-
the Dinkies were confined pretty much just to the city of Delaware.
okay. So Larry, can you answer, does the Bunty Station have to do with the railroad station along Bunty
I don't think
Station?
there's ever a station,
Okay,
Bunty Station.
I don't think there was a station there, and somebody has told me, and Sherry, that's a good question, I've got to do
yeah.
some more research on Bunty Station Road.
Arthur
and how it got
Swartz.
its name. Arthur Swartz would know.
And,
absolutely,
yeah,
sure.
these people that die on us,
Yeah,
we
they
need their
do,
information.
they do.
But here's the other thing I wanted to
Yeah.
say. Behind you on the mantle, we have some tokens for the CDM
Oh,
and
wow,
also
yeah.
some tickets that we were given to ride on the CDM. The tickets are in the envelope, and in that little jar there,
That's cool.
are some tokens. And we had a house here in Powell that is on the South Liberty Street, just past local routes on the left, where there is now a business. It used to be a bank for a while, and
Yeah,
now
right.
it's coffee or something. Anyway, it was known as the Kibbe House.
Okay.
People by the name of Kibbe, and it was our understanding that he used to go to meet the CDM over at 23, Route
Okay.
23, and he would pick up travelers and bring them back, and his home was a bed and breakfast.
Oh my gosh.
And his
He
wife
was an
would keep him.
enterprising fellow, wasn't
Yeah,
he?
yeah, so that's our connection.
I can remember another story about the CDM, and you remember, you talk about, him going over and getting, getting folks to come over here to his bed and breakfast. Well, there was a motorman who lived in the Radnor area, and he and his wife had a little baby, and the baby had colic. Well, if you ever had a colicky baby, you know that they can't they cry a lot, and discomfort and so forth, and all night, and it's hard to comfort the little ones. Well, he figured out that the only way to comfort that kid and to get that kid to go to sleep would be to take the little one out on the CDM and ride, and the little one would go to sleep. And a true story. Another true story occurred back near the turn of the century, when the Crown Prince of Korea came for a visit, official state visit. He came through Central Ohio. Well, so the story goes, something happened where somebody said something and it was close to fisticuffs. And the Crown Prince started using a unheard of in America way of self-defense, which was Taekwondo. And it's probably a good thing that the American, whoever, didn't want to, go with the fisticuffs, because he probably would have got wiped out. But another true story of the CDM. And I like that story about the colicky baby, and the only way that they could get that youngster quieted was the gentle rolling back and forth and the sounds of the car. I can just imagine riding on the CDM. Now, the parlor cars, one other comment, parlor cars that they bought in 1926, they bought two of them, the 500 and the 501, all steel parlor cars. Those were capable of speeds of up to, believe it, get this, 100 miles an hour.
Really?
100 miles an hour on straightaways. Now, I'm not sure if a car ever got up that far, because probably the track did not support it, but they definitely went 78 miles an hour, particularly on the flat straightaways north of Delaware, up by Troy Road on up to Radnor and Prospect. Definitely that fast, but can you imagine that?
When was that?
That would be in 1926, they bought two of those cars,
Incredible.
and they lasted till the end of the CDM, which was in the fall. I think it took its early fall, like late August, early September of 1933, when the last run occurred. They finally shut its doors, and then they went to the bus thing for a couple of years, which didn't last. And
So they basically ran 30 years. They started, what, 1902, I think?
1902,
And went to
about 30
33.
years, exactly, about 30 years. And the Delaware Electric Street Railway lasted about that same period,
When did they
1890.
take up those tracks? Am I dreaming, or do
Well,
I remember the
there are
tracks
still,
on Sandusky Street when I was a boy? Just the
you
tracks.
may have. I can remember the tracks on Elizabeth Street down by the Arts Council. I can still remember that. In fact, the tracks are still buried under the street there, as far as I know. The reason that I have and I was telling, one of my prized possessions is a 3-foot section of Delaware Electric Street Railway track. It came out of East Winter Street. And in 2003, Delaware underwent what they called a streetscape program, where they improved the sidewalks and beautified the streets and so forth. They dug up East Winter Street. Well, I parked down on East Winter Street across from the Strand Theater, and I was walking back to my office one day, and I see this big pile of rails sitting there. And, the stuff's going on in my head. And I went up to a guy that I thought was in charge, and happened to be the foreman on the job, and I said, "What are you going to do with that?" And he says, "Oh, we're just going to junk it." And I said, "Do you mind if I saw this piece of about 3-foot rail. I said, "Do you mind if I take that piece?" He says, "If you can come here within an hour before the trucks are supposed to come and get it, you can have it." So I remember calling my son, who has just finished college, and he drove my wife's station wagon down, and he and I, it was everything we could do to lift that thing. And I got in my garage. And
3 feet?
pardon me, about
Just
3
3
feet, 3-foot section of Delaware Electric Street Railway track.
You got yourself a good animal.
I do.
What was that, about 70 pound per foot?
Yeah, I would say it was pretty heavy rail, yeah.
Just wondered if the station wagon survived.
Yeah. Thank you. We didn't have that far to go. We lived just west of the hospital, so we just went out Central Avenue. And but yeah, and I've got a fella who owns a company in town on London Road that works with steel and creates banisters and handrails and that sort of thing. And he's offered, he says, "You bring that by any time, I'll have my guys clean it up for you, cut it up if you want." So I've told my wife this, and she says, "Well, how are you going to get it over there?" "I'm certainly not going to help you lift it up. Well, I can't lift it myself, so I'll have to get somebody to come over and help me lift that in and get that over to Craig's place and clean it up." But actual true story, I've got a piece of Delaware, and that's one of my prized possessions. That's pretty cool, yeah. Well, I have enjoyed spending a little time with you. It's very warm. Thank you all for enduring the heat and for sitting here. And this is a wonderful place. Linda, thank you so much for the kind invitation to join you here this evening, and it's been my pleasure to
Thank you.
have fun. Okay, I'm done.
Excellent.
Where is the
Was that just?
seven